Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Rada Madrigal, and I'll be taking you through today's session. I am joined virtually by some of my colleagues who may speak up during Q&A or to provide clarity when needed as we discuss today's topic. And today we're here to conduct a refresher training for the Flexible Ramping Product Refinements Deliverability Initiative. In an effort to increase transparency and provide greater services to our stakeholders, we are recording this webinar. It will be posted on our website so that you can review it in the future, and for those who are not able to join today's call. The slides that we are looking at are posted on kaisa.com, and you can find them on the release planning page, the ISO Learning Center, and I've also posted them to the policy initiatives page that relates to flexible ramping products. So 3 different places for you. A little bit of housekeeping. I have set it up so that everybody is muted upon entry. You have the ability to unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question. You can also put your questions into the chat pod. Mo has posted a link to the slides that we are going through now for your reference. Thank you, Mo, for doing that there in the chat. If you do have a question, I'd like to ask that you address that to everyone in the chat instead of just individually to myself. I may not be able to see all of those if they scroll, if a lot of them kind of scroll by. So that way, Mo, who is going to be my producer today, she can assist me with making sure that I see all of your questions and that we get those answered. So if you have a question that you want to put in the chat pod, please direct that to everyone. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask a question verbally as well. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. The training today is going to cover a review of the project changes with this initiative. And then I've put out kind of carved out a section called key points. And the goal here is to identify the main items that are changing and to help you, our customers, prepare for the go live of this initiative on February 1st by pointing out to you what reports are going away, where new reports are going to be located, and where you should be looking to find information on FRP going forward. At the end, we'll also review the application changes that you will see along with the settlement changes. I do want to point out, just as a note, that most of the application changes that we look at, except for the BAOP changes for our WEIM entities, those changes were covered in the initial training session that I did back in September of 2022. So some of this will be a review of reports that you may have already seen before if you attended that September session, and other items may be new to you as well. This is just a list of acronyms that we're going to be, that you'll be seeing across these slides, and for the ability to refer back to them if needed as we go through this session, if you see something that you're unfamiliar with. You can follow along through the slides. So first of all, we're just kicking off with understanding what the challenge was initially and why we embarked on improving the flexible ramping product and the way it's calculated. So essentially what we did here is improve the deliverability of the flexible ramping product by way of nodal procurement. We did this to address concerns that existed where we had flexible ramping capacity that was being awarded, but it was behind transmission constraints that were binding. And in those situations, those binding transmission constraints actually prevented that flex ramp capacity from being deployable if uncertainty materialized. So from a reliability perspective, not all the flexible ramping awards were actually deliverable, and there was some concern there because the system is relying on that capacity in those situations. So there was a need discovered that we addressed with this project. So primarily one of the items that are changing is the procurement of FRP through this nodal pricing model. And now I wanted to go through at a high level what's changing from an initiative perspective, and then we'll go to the key points of things that I really want you to focus on for go live. As I stated with the pricing, so FRP will now be modeled by location of the nodes that are in the ISO market network model to make sure that these awards are both feasible to deliver and also appropriately priced. So there will be flexible ramping nodal prices and also prices at the scheduling points or ties. I will be showing you where you can see what those prices are in OASIS when we get to those application pages. This locational modeling of pricing consists of the real-time market actually considering transmission constraints during that calculation and as the market engine runs that solution. Also looks at the energy flows that would occur when the real-time market dispatches energy from capacity scheduled to provide that flexible ramping product capability. And for those of you that attended the September session, these slides, a couple of these slides here are going to be similar to what you saw then. And then the new portion is going to kind of come in when we get to the key points. But I did want to revisit some of this content just to set the stage for you. So with regard to procurement of flexible ramping product in the WEIM space, the ISO is continuing to maintain the current RSE rules that limit the WEIM energy transfers. So when a balancing authority area fails those sufficiency evaluations to the amount scheduled in the market interval preceding that failure, then the real-time market will only procure FRP from a failing BAA's own resources. The procurement target will be the amount calculated to meet that BAA's individual uncertainty and forecasted ramping needs and would be feasible to deliver. So if you are a BAA that fails the flex test, if we look at this graph here, you would be the slice of the chart that is in blue, as you would have an individual targets that you would be meeting, whereas for everyone that is in the passing group, the FRP is procured for that entire BAAs, or sorry, from the entire set of BAAs among those that pass that flex test. So the target for a BAA that does not pass those sufficiency tests, the target would not include the benefit of pooling that uncertainty of everyone across the WEIM footprint. And also this prevents a BAA that has insufficient resources to meet RP needs from actually leaning on the capacity of other BAAs. Did want to point out that if there is a situation when a WEIM BAA is experiencing a contingency and there's that contingency flag, that BAA will actually be removed from either the flex up and flex down passing group definition. There will be no procurement of flex ramp up or down for a BAA that is going through or experiencing a contingency. A couple of other key points with regards to flex ramp up and down. There are no capacity bids for FRU or FRD. These are actually priced opportunity costs. And when we are looking at that calculation, only 5-minute dispatchable resources are eligible to receive those awards for either flex ramp up or down. If you have a variable energy resource, these are scheduled up to their forecast, and they could be awarded either a flex ramp up or down. And when we go through the deployment scenarios, when we're actually deploying or calling upon that flex ramp capacity, those variable energy resources, either flex ramp up or down awards, are deployed when we are going through that deployment scenario. As well as all physical transmission or transfer constraints that are enforced in the original market calculation are also going to be enforced if we're actually deploying that flex ramp capacity. And that is either flex ramp up or down. More points here. When we are distributing those requirements in the deployment scenarios in each BAA, that gets divided among load, solar, and wind resources, and how we allocate those allocation factors are derived from historical data that reflect the relative contributions of those resource classes to overall uncertainty. Did I hear someone speaking.
Yeah,
Does somebody
Rhoda,
have a question?
I'm sorry to jump in, Rhoda. It's Michael Martin. Could you jump back? I'm sorry to interrupt. Jump back to your last slide. And there was a clarification that the last bullet says that it's all base case and contingency constraints. Just to let folks know that we're phasing things in. So in the first initial release, it's just going to be base case flow gates, and we outlined this in the BPM. So I noticed this. We might want to update that we're doing a phased-in approach here. Thanks.
Okay, thanks,
Can I jump in with a
Michael.
question? Can I jump in with a
go
question
ahead.
here too? This is actually more of a parking lot question because it's not directly related. This is Alvis Svoboda from BGenie. But I notice you say that only 5-minute dispatchable resources are eligible for flex ramp up and down awards. We've been, involved in the DAME initiative, and the premise there, as I understood it, was that imbalance reserves would be procured on a 15-minute dispatchable basis. And so I'm not sure if that's consistent. That would imply that in combination with this bullet, it would imply that you could be procuring imbalance reserves that would not be usable for flexible ramping. So just a question for that. It doesn't really relate to this, and I appreciate your detail here, but I did want to put it in the parking lot.
Sure. It's Michael Martin again. I can jump in with a quick answer. So yeah, the FRP, of course, is going in before DAME. So what this is referring to is it's only 5-minute RTD dispatchable. So your typical 15-minute or hourly interchange are not eligible. So that's kind of that's what we're focused here. It's a today's world.
Okay. So there'd be some changes potentially happening when DAME is implemented to make this work with DAME. That is what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's good enough for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
We do have another question in the chat. And this one is from Mariana Meza from BPA. And I'm sorry, Mariana, this person asks, are non-participating VERS considered 5-minute dispatchable or only participating VERS?
Only participating VERS.
Thank you, Michael.
Sure.
All right, thanks for that, Michael. Thanks for that clarification on here about rolling out the various contingencies that we're going to be looking at, or the various constraints. So we're starting off with the base cases with only the flow gates and not contingency constraints going forward with this initiative. So thanks for that note. And then let's see, getting to this slide here. Other points? I think we talked about the first one. So next, for flex ramp up or down demand elasticity, this is achieved with the surplus variables with cost curves that reflect the expected cost of foregoing either that flex ramp up or down procurement. This makes sure that we're not procuring flex ramp up or down at a higher cost than the benefit actually provides. Mo, I do feel like I hear static from a line that might still be open. I don't know if you can help me find that person. I think maybe we found it now. Thanks. And then finally on this slide, flex ramp up or down surplus variables are modeled as independent controls in each of the surplus zones, which effectively relaxes the distributed requirements in that respective zone. And we have a note about those zones in just a moment. So we're talking about actually procuring flexible ramping capacity. And then in the event that we need to actually deploy that capacity, we're going to walk through the two different scenarios. There's deployment scenarios for flex ramp up or down. So we're going to walk through first the flex ramp up deployment scenario. Here we're indicating that all of the flex ramp up awards are going to be deployed. that demand, wind, and solar forecast for each BAA that failed its sufficiency test gets adjusted by the flex ramp-up requirement for that individual BAA. And that demand, wind, and solar forecasts for the group of BAAs that passed flex ramp-up sufficiency test gets adjusted by that flex ramp-up requirement for that entire BAA group. Also in the deployment scenario, it's indicating that the surplus for flex ramp up in each BAA that failed, their sufficiency test is fully deployed, and that the flex ramp up surplus in the group of BAAs that passes their flex ramp sufficiency test is fully deployed there as well. So this is a flex ramp up deployment scenario. We also have a flex ramp down deployment scenario that we'll walk through. And then I think we're going to talk a little bit about zones. So with the flexible ramping down deployment scenario, we're saying here in this case, all of the flex ramp down awards would be deployed. If you are a BAA that fails that flex ramp down sufficiency test, then your demand, wind, and solar forecasts get adjusted by that requirement for your individual BAA. If you are in the group of BAAs that passed the flex ramp down sufficiency test, that gets adjusted. Your demand, wind, and solar forecasts get adjusted by the requirement for that entire BAA group. And again, with regard to surplus in each BAA that fails the flex ramp down sufficiency test is fully deployable, as well as the surplus for the group of entire BAAs that pass the flex ramp sufficiency test, that is fully deployed as well. So both of those scenarios, the solution has them being fully deploying all of those awards. I did want to mention something about the surplus zones that we talked about. So we have defined and maintained surplus zones for each BAA in the WEIM area. Those zones include generation and load nodes, so that every gen and load node in a BAA belongs to only one FRP surplus zone. And in the case of the CAISO BA, this includes all of the CAISO scheduling points as well. We use these flex ramp product surplus zones to distribute the surplus variables. We have 4 of them for CAISO that align with the 4 TAC areas. And for the WEIM BAAs, there's 1 surplus zone for the entire BAA, except for those that have custom load aggregation points. So right now that would be Bank and PSCO, where the FRP surplus zones align with those custom load aggregation points. Now this was kind of a flyover at a high level of what was changing. I know we had some questions, but I wanted to give an opportunity here to see if anybody had any high level questions before we dive into the key points that I wanted to share. Because we've been going for a little bit here, and I want to make sure you get your questions answered. So are there any questions at this point?
We do have a question from Scott Lehman, and Scott says, on slide 13, if we can go back to slide 13, his question is, are the demand, wind, or solar forecasts themselves adjusted based on pass or fail the RSE test or the RSE test, or is the uncertainty associated with them adjusted?
So based on my was there someone who wanted to answer that question? I couldn't tell who's speaking.
Go ahead, Lada.
Okay, thanks, Mel. Based on my understanding, it is the forecast for demand, wind, and solar that gets adjusted by the flex requirement. And I don't know if I have a SME on the phone here to confirm or deny that understanding, but that's what I have.
Yeah, Rada, this is Whitey. I can take the question.
Okay, thank you.
Too many mute on my on this WebEx. So Scott, I assume your question is for the second bullet point, right? This is for the FRD requirement, how we distribute them down to individual locations. So if you can think of some simple, put it in simple scenario, let's say for CAISO, we have FRD requirement, let's say it's 100 100 megawatt. So at the same time, we have to procure 100 megawatt of FRD. So those 100 megawatt uncertainty FRD uncertainty requirement were distributed down to individual locations. Demand, wind, solar, those are the locations contribute to the uncertainty. So those are derived based on the LDF and their forecast numbers. So basically, if their forecast is high, they will get a higher distribution of the uncertainty requirement at that location. Does this answer your question, Scott? So it doesn't matter whether the BA. Okay, you're welcome.
Yeah. So
so whether the BAA pass or fail the RC test is kind of irrelevant in distributing down, because because market has to find out exactly how many. Even if you're in a passing group, we assess how many requirements is assigned to a particular BAA inside the group based on their wind demand and solar coefficients and all these LDF forecast numbers. So there's a proportion to individual BAAs in the group. No, go ahead.
Thanks, YT. Appreciate it.
Can I ask a question here as well? This is Alva again. Thank you, Ian. Is it true that if a BAA fails the FRD sufficiency test, it has failed the resource sufficiency test in both directions? Is it possible, in other words, for a BAA just to fail in downward flexible ramping and then be pulled out of the pooling of flexible ramping up? Is that the way it works?
Okay, yeah. So a BA can fail either one of the tests or both tests. So the allocation is that's why the allocation of the uncertainty is per direction. Is that what you're asking?
No, I was asking if the consequence then is that you're required to procure all of your flexible ramping within the BAA if you fail the. So in other words, you're required to procure all of your flexible ramping up as well as down if you fail in the downward direction.
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
I'd like to just double check that point to make sure that I'm hearing you correctly, YT. So we're saying you can pass flex ramp up, but fail flex ramp down, and if that is the situation, then you're also removed from the flex ramp up passing group?
No. You're only removed from the flex down passing group. Yeah, you're not in the passing group for the flex down. It's by direction. So you have to fully provide that flex down if you fail the flex down test only.
Right.
Thank you, Radha. I appreciate your bringing that up. That's very helpful.
All right, thanks. I just wanted to make sure we all were on the same page with that. Okay.
Okay, so there's another comment from BPA. So the question is, if BA pass or fail the flex test, the FRP requirement stays the same. Yeah, that's correct. Today's world, whether you pass or fail, there's always BA level test, BA level requirement, as well as the EIM area requirement. So going forward, if you pass the test, there's not going to be individual BA level requirement anymore. It's only the group level. So you have that benefit of pulling from from other BAAs for the flex in that direction. Yeah, does this answer your question, Mariana? Okay, thanks.
I have another question. This one is from Grayson, and Grayson asks, what is the difference between the flex ramp up and flex ramp up and reg up?
Regulation up and down are ancillary services products that are resource specific. You need to be certified to provide ancillary services, and you actually bid in for those market products. And that can be both in the day ahead or in the real time. And you're actually, like I said, submitting bids for those products. Flex ramp up is a real-time market product only, and it's based off of the energy bids that you submit. So it's a different type of product, and it's procured only in real time, and it's procured based off of energy bids that are submitted and not separately bid into. So those are a couple of the different differences between those two types of items. Thanks for the question, Grayson.
Yeah, this is Amber. I'll just add a little bit on the difference between reg and flex as well. Is the time frame that you're looking at is also different for regulation, right? So regulation is the difference that's occurring between the last market run and actual, where the FRP is looking at the difference between RGPD and RTD and then periods within RTD. So because of that, I mean, I think Alex had a follow-up, can regulation up be used to count for flex up? No.
All right, thanks for that, Amber. Any other questions before we move on from this portion? All right, looks like we're good. So this next section, I wanted to pull out a couple of key points specifically to help you be prepared for go live on 2/1 and set your expectations as to what you should be looking for or what you might see differently. One of the first points that I wanted to make with regard to how we determine the pricing for flexible ramping product and how we are moving to this nodal pricing model, there are some reporting changes that you're going to see in CMRI, the Customer Market Results Interface. There are two reports that will no longer contain data, and those are both the FMM and the RTD flexible ramp price breakdown reports. Because the flexible ramping price is going to be one capacity price, it is no longer going to be broken down into components. So those reports in CMRI will no longer contain data as of 2/1, but will still be available for historical purposes. I'll also show you those reports a little bit later in the session when we're or show you the ones where we're going to be providing pricing. So on the right-hand side of the slide, when we're talking about where you'll be able to see those FRP prices, those are going to be in the FMM and the RTD schedule prices reports, and we'll take a look at those when we start walking through the application changes. But I did want to point out there's going to be a couple of reporting changes, and some are going to be going away. Another thing, and this is where we may spend some time in discussion, in today's world, the flex ramp product calculation is calculated a day in advance, and you get a report that provides you 24 hours of your requirements for the following operating day. Moving forward with 2/1 and how we're going to be procuring flexible ramping product, we're also going to be adding in the most recent net load forecast into each calculation as the market runs. And this requirement is therefore, or this requirement potentially can change because we're always incorporating that most recent net load forecast. So you're going to get the exact value for that requirement at T-75, and then it gets updated again at T-55. And then that same value, the T-55 value, will get used at T-40 for those sufficiency tests that we're talking about. I've got another slide that's going to give you a little bit of color on some thresholds. So you have information about requirements that you're going to receive, and we have threshold values for you that will essentially help you provide somewhat of a safeguard for the WEIM entities and are also useful for planning purposes. You know, if you're going into each one of those trade hours, instead of having that one-day look ahead of all of those flex ramp requirement values, because those are going to be changing continuously, we have these thresholds that you'll be able to reference to give you something to plan to. So there's two different thresholds. The first is a seasonal threshold, and those are our current capped thresholds. They will remain. You'll see that there's one up value for all of the hours and also one down value for all of the hours. These get calculated based on the past 90 days. However, it may be adjusted. And when these calculations are being made, we're looking at the 99th percentile calculated for each hour, and we take the largest value and we use that for the flex ramp up capacity for all hours. And then we look at the first percentile calculated for each hour, and we use the largest value there for the down capacity for all hours. So we set those seasonal thresholds for you. And then we also have a new 180-day threshold. Those values are going to differ hour by hour. We calculate these values based on historical data from the past 180 days. We're using the same concept of 99th percentile for each hour that gets used as the up capacity, but it will be used for that respective hour, as opposed to taking the largest value like we do with the seasonal and using that largest value for all of the hours. You will have different thresholds per hour. For the flex ramp up capacity, we're looking at that 99th percentile. And for the first percentile in the flex ramp down direction, we're going to be looking at the first percentile for each hour used and using that as the down capacity for the respective hour. So we'll have those caps. There's a little bit more color explanation on that in the market ops BPM. We just put it in proposed revision request number 1473 that you can take a look at. There's a link to that there if you would like to take a look at that. These 180-day thresholds are also referred to as histogram, and those will be displayed for you in OASIS. And I felt like it was valuable to talk about it here instead of waiting to the OASIS set of reports. So we'll mention it here, and then we'll look at it again when we go through every OASIS change. But there is a report called the Flexible Ramp Requirement Thresholds, and you will see those seasonal values as well as those 180-day thresholds. And they are labeled as histogram, and those are the 180-day thresholds, those ones that are new, those are called histogram. And you will see that those values change hour to hour. The high value is used to cap flex ramp up, and the low value is used to cap flex ramp down. This report gets updated daily at 6 in the morning. And the seasonal thresholds, you'll see the same value for an entire quarter. And currently, the low value we are using as a floor for that is set to 0.1 megawatts for all entities. This information gets updated quarterly. I thought this might be a good time to take a pause in case anybody had any questions about these thresholds, because we're going to move on to other things and then move into applications.
I have a question, Rhoda.
Go ahead.
Going back 2 slides to the forecast, the rolling forecast, is the only value that's being updated there the one for the binding hour, or is it actually a rolling forecast that you're producing there?
Are you talking about on this report or a different report?
No, 2 slides back when you were talking about the forecast. You were showing the daily versus the new hourly net load forecast. Is what you're going to be providing is just going to be the revision for the 1 hour, or are you going to show what it looks like for the whole period of like the short-term unit commitment. I mean, what's going to be produced there? Just the 1 hour?
Just the 1 hour.
So that's what you'll essentially. So there won't be anything available for hours beyond that in Oasis or wherever we're looking for that.
Yeah, and this, I'll show you this one in 2 slides from now. This is actually going to be shown to essentially the market operators for CAISO and for the WEIM partners. They have a tool that they need to look at for as a way for them to, or sorry, to, as they run the market. So it's more a market operator visibility that they'll have, and I'll show that tool, but that's one that we have in the CAISO BA and the WEIM partners have as well for running the WEIM market as well. Okay,
but so there is behind the scenes, there's a forecast that goes out more hours, but we just will not have visibility on that, is basically the way it'll work. Because I'm assuming you would have a flex ramp requirement
with
calculation.
With regard to the flex ramp capacity, yes, there are, we do have the demand forecast that's published. We do have the demand forecast that's published on a, hour ahead, day ahead. That remains, but it's not the same as this, what we're talking about, which is the flexible ramp requirement.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, were there any questions about the histogram values here, both seasonal and, yep.
There was a question from Mariano, and Mariano asked if are there 2 thresholds now, and the CAISO will use the smaller of the 2, that is smaller of the 180-day threshold and seasonal. And Amber from our forecast did respond. She provided the response of, yes, that is correct, and it is the smaller of the 2 that will create the cap. Mariano asked a follow-up question: would the high threshold for down be the minimum of 711 and 1233 for our ending 1? Amber, would you like to add to that, or is that just an example?
Yeah, I think it's an example, but it is a good point. I mean, ultimately, we have multiple thresholds that are in place, and I think that that's important to know. Also, for all those questions that just came as well, is you don't see, like you see a rolling load forecast that's going out. You don't see that with this. You have some of the data that's in the input to have an idea of what that is, but you're going to be protected from the thresholds that are there. You will not go above those. You do have visibility to those. So it will be the lesser amount, the 711 that's there, but there's 3 thresholds, right? There's your 180-day threshold that's going to update throughout the days. There's our current threshold that is a cap that gets updated at minimum of quarterly. And then also know that we have this floor, right? And the floor is currently set at 0.1 megawatts for all the entities. Those are configurable, but they are going to be the protection that as you're planning your day, your thresholds will not change outside of, the requirements will not change outside of the threshold.
Amber, and to your point on the next slide where we're talking about those hourly flex requirements, I've got a note here about that. So we've got those thresholds that act as safeguards, right? The quarterly/seasonal and the ones that get updated daily. We call those the histogram. And then you have, and those are kind of the buffers, if you will, or the thresholds, I guess is the right word since that's the word. And then we've got the hourly flex requirement that CAISO operators and WEIM entity operators see in the BAOP tool, and that is this hourly flex requirement that we're looking at on this page now. So if you pass the flex ramp sufficiency test, your BAA will be included in the flex ramp up or down passing group, which is what we're looking at a screenshot here. If you fail the flex ramp sufficiency test, your BAA will be listed here individually, and then you will see what that hourly flex ramp requirement value is for your individual BAA. This data gets updated hourly, and to your point about whether, you know, that we're going to use the lesser value, the flex ramp requirement number is always going to be the lesser of either this hourly flex requirement or those seasonal or daily values. And as data trends, this flex requirement, this hourly flex requirement, tends to be lower than both the seasonal mosaic value and the daily histogram value. This hourly flex ramp requirement tends to be lower. So the requirement that you are being, or the requirement that you are being judged on or used to pass this is going to be the lesser of those three numbers, either this hourly number, if you are in a failing group and required to use just your resources to hit that target, or the histogram value or the mosaic. If you're in the passing group, then you are kind of in that larger conglomerate, and it's not just your resources that are going to be used to pass that flex ramp sufficiency test, if that makes sense. So those are the threshold values and then the daily value.
We do have a couple more questions. I'm going to tag Amber to answer these questions. But before I start, the first question was asked by Brian Holmes. The question was, it sounds like there's no forward-looking publication of uncertainty, just the binding hour, and that perhaps the suggestion is that the entity use the threshold values for any forward-looking evaluation of uncertainty. That is correct. To your second question, before I hand it off to Amber, your question was, this seems to imply that everyone should always plan to the worst case scenario for every hour. Has there been any analysis of the megawatt impact of this assumption compared to the current process? Amber, if you can take that one.
Yeah, Brian, that's a good question on the megawatt analysis to the current process. And that analysis is not been done, but the guide, right, as you are doing your planning, is I would guide you to the thresholds, right? But the benefit of the new process is that it is dynamic in nature, right? And it's taking in that forecasted information so that you're able to procure more flex ramp when the uncertainty needs are greater, and you're able to procure less flex ramp when the uncertainty needs are not there. That dynamic process does allow it to update, but with the dynamic process doesn't come as much forward visibility. So with that, I would guide you to the requirements and being within those threshold bounds, but it is something that we can look at in the future if is needed.
Thanks, Amber. Can you hear me?
We can.
So I think that the improvement of the overall plan here is pretty good in the hour, or maybe right near the hour. The question is just really about how it works out in the future. And so the guidance is to go to essentially to the thresholds, which is, by definition, quite a stricter amount. And I guess maybe I'll just extend that for a second. Is that, and this may not be known yet, but is that going to be how the ISO anticipates doing the EDAM process, that the day ahead RSE would not be able to make any of these estimates because they're out in the future using forecasts, the coefficients aren't there, whatever. And so the day ahead RSE will be all threshold oriented, or is there an enhancement planned?
Yeah, I mean, the EDAM, I don't want to speak to the EDAM at this time because it's a different ballgame, right? You're doing forward planning in a day ahead perspective, not a real time where you have real time forecast updates coming in, right? You get forecast updates for day ahead. Sometimes we get them twice, right? We get a preliminary look and then we get a final look of forecasts before the day ahead run. So that's a different ballgame, and that will all be assessed when we get through the EDAM process.
I guess I'm bringing it up because my purpose in this is a day ahead purpose, right? So as an EIM entity, you're setting up day ahead your plans, and it seems like we're just going to set up our plans to the most conservative thing, and that didn't used to be the case. And so I just wanted to see if there was a you know, even if it's not in this proposal, if there's a solution on the horizon to that problem.
Yeah, but for that, are you more focused on the EDAM design or the FRP that's going live?
Well, the FRP / the new mechanism for uncertainty and how it affects the resource efficiency evaluations that folks will face when they reach real time, but they have to plan day ahead for something. And it seems like the suggestion is that they plan day ahead for the threshold. And that's where I'm just trying to reconcile that. But I guess there's kind of two parts here. One, am I hearing that correctly? Just plan to the thresholds. That's the advice. And then two, we're not sure if there's an update or an enhancement proposal in the future.
Yeah, I mean, right now with the data that's going to be available on the public sites for the FRP that's going live because of the dynamic nature, the threshold information will be available for you to plan to. I mean, I do hear the concern, and I think if that's something that we need to consider is posting further requirements out or further guides of how to calculate the requirements with the information that's out there. I think that that's something that we could assist with as we're preparing for the new paradigm, and would like to hear from everybody if that's something that's really needed to help, because there are coefficients and other information that Rada will get to in a little bit with this information that's posted, and I think that that could be a guide to help entities calculate. You know, it's dynamic in nature, but calculate an idea of what those requirements might be, and that might be a good way to get us in the middle ground.
And maybe so yes, that's what I was seeking, and I was kind of directed towards this training. I've asked this question in a few different forms, so perhaps if you're the right person to have this conversation with, we can continue it.
Well, I think it's important to have it with everybody too, though. There might be others that are having the same questions, and I think that that's appropriate as we go through the training. That's what it's for. So, yeah, we definitely see that. I mean, right now, the easiest way to look at it is to look at the requirements that are out there and be able to plan to those because of the dynamic nature that FRP is going to be under.
And when you say the requirements, you meant the thresholds there.
Thresholds, yes. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. I'll probably have a follow-up after we see the rest of the OASIS reports.
All right, good discussion, folks. I appreciate it. So I think we're going to dive into the application-specific details now and give us a chance to take a look at those. We're first going to take a look at changes to displays in BayUp, which is a tool that our WEIM partners have as part of running the market, as well as the tool that the CAISO operators have for our slice of running the market as well. So we have constraints that we look at in this tool. We're changing a display to show some additional information with regard to the binding transmission constraints. So if you recall, we are changing the way that FlexRamp is procured and taking into account these transmission constraints. We've added an additional column that's called scenario type to indicate the type of constraint that is binding and in which scenarios. So just like today, operators are able to identify congestion on their flow gates if they see a specific base scenario. And what we're adding here are scenarios for, I say scenario and scenario separately in one sentence. That's just a random thought. But we're adding those for FlexRamp up and down that provide more information to the operator so that they can see how their resources are being used. So in FlexRamp up or down scenarios, these alert the operator that the ramping capacity may not be available when it's needed to be dispatched. And in this case, the operator may need to take action to mitigate that problem, either maybe through a manual dispatch or load bias, which we call imbalance conformance. We're going to walk through a couple of these different examples so that we can see what we're talking about. From a situation, so we're looking at the real-time binding transmission constraints, and you'll look at a specific interval. And here we're seeing that we've got all three types that exist in the same interval. There's base, flex ramp up and down in the same interval on the same flow gate. This scenario provides more information that both flex ramp up or down awards could be impacted by the congestion, and it gives the operator more information to aid them in their troubleshooting process. Since the base type exists and the cleared values exceed the binding limits, this should be considered exactly like today, where the market sees an overload. And so it's kind of just providing some situational awareness here. What the operator does next depends on other situations. So for example, in this case, we're looking at an interval where there's only flex ramp up or down on a specific flow gate and time interval. In this case, we are not seeing any base called out, and therefore we're saying that congestion is not actually realized, but just projected. So this is an indication that the operator might need to take some action, but it would be dependent on the time of day, the current and the next hour grid conditions. They may not need to do anything since the market is actually going to be actively trying to solve this issue. With the implementation of this enhancement, there is going to be a learning curve with FlexRamp product. So operators need to be mindful of when this appears and how it gets handled, so they can kind of use after the fact studies to build their own best practices around when you see something like this, whether you should do something or not do something, take any action, again, depending on the time of day and other things that might be happening. We have a couple more examples on this same constraint. For example, when we see only base and no flex ramp up or down listed, this means that there's congestion, but it's not occurring as a result of either flex ramp up or down. And actually the counterflows of the flex ramp product awards may actually help resolve this issue. So we're saying in this case, the operator should proceed as they normally would, given that there is congestion. And those were the transmission constraints. So that's going to be just a new column added for additional visibility. This is the UI that I just spoke about when we talked about the key points, but it is a BAYOP screen, and so we're going to just revisit it here. This UI identifies what the aggregated values of flex ramp up and down is for all of the WEIM entities who pass their resource sufficiency evaluation flex ramp sufficiency test by T-40. So these tests get measured separately for both flex ramp up and down during that resource sufficiency evaluation for each of those entities individually. After the final run, which takes place at T-40, each entity is going to be able to take a look at this and see whether or not they passed and failed. If you failed either flex ramp or down, you would see your BAA listed here separately. If you don't see your BAA listed separately, you are part of the larger passing group. And what has changed is how those results now feed into the FlexRamp BAA factors for both the real-time dispatch and the real-time pre-dispatch. These requirements end up being shared across all of the WEIM entities that pass those FlexRamp sufficiency tests in that direction, either up or down. And so for those entities in the passing group, they know that any of their participating resources, so those that they have submitted a bid or base schedule for during that interval, they may be used for that FlexRamp product movement or for uncertainty. And the idea here is that everyone is now contributing to the requirement in that larger aggregate. So your neighbors with their resources can help if they can electrically, which gives kind of the whole group or footprint more incentive to pass those FRP tests to free up more capacity and to avoid incurring settlement causation costs, which we'll take a look when we get to the end in the settlements piece. We'll kind of talk about how those costs get allocated out. But this was just a look at that screen in BAYOP. I also have another screen, and this is where it's going to show those nodal FRP prices. It gives the operators insight into the costs that may be associated if FRP up or down is incurred and at what node. And this information is just another tool that the operator can use in their when they're making those decisions for how to manage their area within their market parameters. And so you'll see those prices here in a new display in BAOP as well. And one other thing that I wanted to mention with regard to the way flexible ramping product is being procured, we have on the left side of this chart the monthly and hourly aggregations for 2017 and 2018. And you can see in the red all of the FRP that was, or all of the flexible ramping that was not delivered or undeliverable. It was a significant amount. And the goal here is that now that we are using those transmission constraints and other binding constraints to determine flexible ramping products along with the nodal pricing, the goal here is that that, along with the implementation of the shared requirement, could reduce the need for operators to have to do as much load biasing, or we also call that imbalance conformance in the WEIM space. But again, this is something that will need to be studied to see if that actually is a benefit, just something we kind of wanted to point out for you here. We're going to move away from BAOP now and move to CMRI. So I wanted to stop and see if there's any questions about the BAOP tool before we move into looking at the reports.
I'm looking for any hand raises. I don't see any, and I don't believe there's any questions currently in the chat. So if you do have something that you'd like to add in the chat or would like to raise your hands and vocalize, please feel free to. Otherwise, Radha, I don't see any additional questions at this time.
All right, and I see a question referring to Mosaic, so I'm going to hold off until we get to the OASIS space, but perhaps our SMEs can be taking a look at that in the meantime. And we'll go through the CMRI reports, and then we'll talk about the OASIS data, which will discuss those threshold values. So first in CMRI, I did mention that there were 2 reports that were going to be going away. I'm just pointing them out to you on the menu here. So the real-time reports for both FMM and RTD flex ramp price breakdowns, those will no longer contain data as of 2/1, but we will have them available for prior trade dates for historical purposes. So those reports are going away after 2/1 as with regard to new data being published. And there are 4 FRP reports on that same menu that you can look at. The reports themselves have not changed. It is more the calculation behind those reports because we are going to be calculating and procuring FRP differently. So we'll just take a look at those side by side just for reference purposes. We've got both the FMM and the RTD schedule prices reports. And you can see that, and I've kind of put a circle around ramp up and ramp down in both of these cases, just to point out that you'll be able to see that flex ramp product data on these reports, but when it comes to changes to the actual report, the columns are all the same, the layout of the report is the same. It's just behind the scenes how we calculate that FRP price is going to change as of 2/1, and you will see those new prices reflected on these reports. Similarly, we have those FMM and RTD schedule reports. The report columns and layout are the same, but you will have the ability to see in CMRI what your FMM and RTD schedules were for flex ramp up and down in any of the intervals that apply. So those were the CMRI reports. And before we move to OASIS, I wanted to see if there's any questions on the CMRI reports.
Our SMEs are still researching the previous question from Mariano regarding what we should expect for the raw uncertainty under the Mosaic approach versus stay with the uncertainty, increase some hours and decrease other hours. So they are working on that. Unless our SMEs would like to speak on that, I can also take the response and put it in the chat after. Okay.
Well,
so
we have, yeah. we have those reports still to look at when we get to the OASIS section. So if we have that information when we get to that slide, definitely we can share that. Or if it comes later, we can put it into the chat. Let's handle it that way. It doesn't look like there's any questions on the CMRI report. So I'm going to move on, and that's pretty makes sense because they're pretty straightforward. So I'm going to move on to the OASIS section, which I think is where the bulk of the questions are going to be with regard to data, old and new. So we'll walk through the OASIS changes, and where appropriate, we'll stop to address questions that come up. So first, with regard to prices, there's going to be new reports on OASIS under the Prices tab, both the flexible ramping nodal prices and also the flexible ramping scheduling point and tie nodal prices. I think we looked at the flexible ramping nodal prices report back in September, but we didn't yet have this scheduling point one. So we'll look at those two here. The flexible ramping nodal prices report, this is going to show you those nodal prices at the P node level for all the price nodes, the SB ties and the AP nodes calculated by RTD and RTPD binding market run. So you're going to see that information as it comes out. And the scheduling point and tie nodal prices as well. So you will see the flexible ramp prices information in OASIS off of the prices menu. There's also going to be some more reports with regard to shadow pricing. So there is, I'm pointing out there's flex ramp constraint results, which is an existing report that is still going to contain data, and you can take a look at that, but there's also going to be two new reports that are added, and that is the flexible ramping constraint shadow prices and the flexible ramping scheduling constraint shadow prices. So we'll walk through those. First, the existing report. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I wanted to, and I may be stepping on you, but on the nodal price report, is that available only by P node, or is it also going to be available by AP node?
That's going to be available by AP node as well.
It is available by AP nodes, great. So that's just going to be, and that will just be the P node prices allocated just the way they would be for load. I mean, for the distribution, same distribution factors for load or generation.
I believe so. I don't know the answer to that depth, so I don't want to lead you astray, but it's going to be.
It will be prices.
If you have a deeper question, maybe ask it so we can get that color, but I don't have a deeper answer.
I missed it when I was looking at it, but thank you. Anyway, that's fine.
Okay, this is enough? Okay, yeah. All right, great. So we were here on the shadow prices, or the existing report, flex ramp constraint results. So you'll be able to see the flex ramp up and down shadow prices and requirements for the BAAs that fail, that resource efficiency evaluation, and for the passing group. So those will be broken out, and those will be calculated by market runs. So either the RTPD or the RTD. And then we've got, there is the flexible ramping constraint shadow prices, and this shows the transmission constraint shadow prices for those deployment scenarios. And then we have the next one, which shows the scheduling constraint shadow prices. And so, frankly, this is going to be, you know, a way for you to deconstruct this data with regard to if you need to validate anything in the settlement space. So you've got information about what the transmission constraint shadow prices were in this one report, and then the scheduling constraint shadow prices in this other report. So you can kind of break that information out. I imagine that that would be useful from a settlements perspective when you're trying to chase some that information down. The next thing that I wanted to share is on the energy menu, and I think I did something to cause these to move over a little bit slightly when I published this. But there are, the flexible ramp requirements report will not contain data as of 2/1. but it will remain there for prior trade dates, and somehow I've got extra animation here that I didn't think was there, but we'll just flow with it. But the one that I was trying to point out here was this top one, the Flex Ramp Requirements screen. And this is a report that we talked about a little bit earlier that was going away from a 24-hour perspective, right? You used to get your Flex Ramp requirement as a static number or as a 24 hours in advance, all 24 hours of the day, and you had that information. And now we are giving you those histogram and mosaic values, the thresholds that you can use, but the actual Flex Ramp requirement is going to be available in BAYOP the hour before. So it's a little bit different. Now this is kind of, I did make a note down here on this slide that kind of speaks to what Amber was mentioning, and that is that we do have reports here in OASIS, the Flex Ramp requirement thresholds and the Flex Ramp requirements uncertainty histograms that provide data that you can use to calculate the Flex Ramp requirements. With that said, in order to calculate and try to project forward that Flex Ramp requirement, you'll also need to have your forecast data for each 15-minute interval of the trade date for solar, for wind, and demand. So you will have to have information that kind of can be plugged into those calculations and projected forward. And I think that we'll mention that here, but until we have each one of these individual reports to take a look at, and so maybe I want to check in with you, Amber, to see, do you want to talk now about how they would project that forward, or do we want to walk through each individual OASIS slide and kind of come to, so we can see the report on the screen before we get to talking about the individual components?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's worth going through each individual area on the screen and then talk about the reports, because it may be that it's worthwhile based on the questions that come in after you go through what's already published to potentially put additional slides together as well.
Okay, and that's kind of the angle I was going, but I didn't know if you wanted to talk about it here. So we'll move forward and we'll talk through each OASIS screen, and then, you know, feel free to speak up to add that context. All right, so we're going to take a look at the OASIS reports. There's these are the ones off of the pricing menu. Flex Ramp Test Results Group will show the passing group ID and failing entities and show you the ability, or give you the ability to determine which entities are part of the WEIM area requirement versus individual requirements for themselves. So that's going to be the result of the Flex Ramp test and who falls into what group. Then we have the Flexible Ramp forecasts, and these are the total RTD and RTPD binding and advisory resources forecast grouped by the entity and by technology type. So for solar and for wind, this report will also have a demand forecast component. I think these are off the energy menu and not the prices menu, so I may need to make an adjustment to this. That doesn't look right, but I'll fix that. And then this next one is the Flex Ramp requirement thresholds. So this is the threshold values for the Flex Ramp up or down for each BAA and WEIM area. So we've got those histogram and mosaic values that are going to be provided, and that is in this threshold report. And now we're going to take a look at some of the, what I like to refer to as the ingredients. I've stolen that term from one of the SMEs here. Is you're going to get down into where we have a report that's the Flexible Ramp Requirement Input Polynomials. And so this is going to give you the 5 and the 15-minute low and high polynomial coefficients for the mosaic, the wind and solar, and the demand. And this is going to be forecast by WEIM entity and area. I don't know if there's any additional color about the polynomials that you wanted to add here, Amber, or if it was to the uncertainty histogram one that we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, this is Tobias. I can jump in just because I think there was a previous question as well related to Mosaic. So I wanted to step back first and look at that question. So that was talking about generally what the expectation would be as far as the requirement being higher for some hours and lower for others. So the answer, I guess I would say for that is when we ran some simulation efforts, and we found that on average that the requirements between the existing and Mosaic came down on average. So it's tough to say hour to hour because now the Mosaic requirement is essentially new every 15 minutes. But yeah, we saw that as a consistent trend throughout seasons as well. So generally lower, and the comparable coverage as our current requirement. So that was the first point. And I guess the second point in relation to these reports and how to actually use this data and to recalculate it. I think as far as the benefit of this forum, I think it's something that we would point to documentation, or could potentially provide a more explicit, like with all the given calculations to actually work with these coefficients. But what I wanted to kind of provide as far as the polynomials here, so the way in which you would use these if you wanted to potentially guide actions for the next day is you have to combine these with forecasts at your demand, wind, and solar level, and essentially you multiply the actual forecast by these coefficients, and that gets rolled up into this Mosaic variable that then we multiply that with the Mosaic coefficients that are provided on the same page. So you see the demand, solar, wind, and Mosaic. So I guess in respect to this forum right now, probably be better to put that in documentation. But that's kind of, I think we're just kind of showing right now that all this information is available to recreate the calculation and then potentially project it forward if you have your own forecast for demand, solar, and wind at a 15-minute level for the next trade date. So I hope that brought some clarity to that question.
Thanks, Tobias. I think what I'll say is if we get that, or maybe I should say when we get that example that we can share in documentation, so that people can kind of pore over it or comb through it, maybe what we can commit to do, Mo, if you can help remind me, is that we'll, we have a list of everybody who dialed into this call, right? And so we can send you an email letting you know when it has been posted so that you can get it immediately. And then I'm sure we'll send that information out to a broader audience as well. And we'll do it that way. Because I think the example would be valuable, and it looks like folks are curious to see how that would work out. But instead of kind of working through something on the fly for you here on this call, we'll get something a little more concrete and put it down on paper so that you can comb through it.
Absolutely.
All right, so that was the polynomials. We also have flex ramping.
Can I make a quick request when you do that? Because I think that would be valuable. To do maybe a couple quick things. One is to use the data that's available to the group, maybe for whichever hour or interval or BA you choose. Because I did try to multiply it through, and I didn't get the answers I was expecting. And I don't know if that's just because the map stage data is, sometimes has some issues. And it takes a while to kind of assemble all the pieces that are required. And so it'd be great if there was like a day or at least a couple of hours where we feel like we could go look at the data ourselves and tie it out. Is that a reasonable ask to go with that calculation?
Yeah, I think, that makes sense.
Okay, that would be great. And then the second piece is, some of the data is the coefficients, they come out sometime. I don't know whether it's map stage or what, but I'd just be curious when each report is scheduled for publication, if that's not in the next couple of slides.
I can point that out for you, but also OASIS has a publication report that you can look at that will tell you every report and when it's published. So like the one that we're looking at right now gets posted daily at 6 a.m. And this other one, the histogram or the polynomials as well.
Okay, that's fantastic. Yeah. I didn't know that, and that I would be very interested to see that schedule. Is it on OASIS? Yeah, it is. Okay. It is under one of the first tabs. Mo, okay. I think can give us the direction in the chat, but yeah, it's like report publication list, and there's a report on OASIS that tells you when all of the reports are published. So yes, it's available out there for you. I'm curious how we will solve for the uncertainty for hours ending 1 through 7 if it's published at 6, but maybe I will find out. It's published at 6 for the following trade day. For the next day? So, okay. Yeah. That's not consistent with what I've been seeing, but that could just be map stage. So thank you for that. Yeah, I would say it's probably map stage data, but in production, that's going to be posted at 6 a.m. every day for the following trade day. All right, so we were here. This is we were talking about the polynomials. There we go. Mo has the steps that you would go to define the OASIS publication schedule. She's posted that in the chat for you. Yes, it's very helpful. This particular uncertainty histogram gives you, or we talked about this one already. The next one is an existing report. Oh, this is one. So I just added this slide. It's not in the posted presentation. I'm going to update this presentation and put it a little bit later this afternoon. But in discussion before the session, we wanted to bring up the FlexRamp requirement inputs and outputs. So we have the results of all of those tests here broken out by individual BAA as a slide here. And Tobiah, I'll pass it over to you because I think this is a slide that you wanted to share with everybody just to point something out. So help refresh my memory on what the point was that you wanted to make on this particular slide for folks.
Yeah, so essentially here is, since in OASIS there's not I guess an explicit tracking of the net load uncertainty or the requirement that you see from BAYOP for the RTD and then the RTPD horizon. So what you can look at, and this is also can kind of touch on Brian's point from earlier in the presentation, but this report, if you look at, you go to snapshot indicator and either the T55 or the T40 minute for any given hour, it will show you that requirement. So your 15-minute requirement that you're actually being, that's coming from the net load uncertainty calculation will be visible. So it'll be under this net load uncertainty column. So test status, net load uncertainty, and then test indicator. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, and that just corresponds to 15 minutes after the hour, 30 minutes after the hour, and then you see the hour ending that actually corresponds to. So Another approach for guidance is if you have potential a comparable weather day, you will have this track of what your 15-minute requirement was from the previous day, and you can kind of use that as an additional guide for this is probably what my requirement is going to look like. So that was just another thing that I wanted to point out as far as a reference to give customers there.
Thanks for that. I appreciate it. All right, we've gone through the OASIS, and now we're going to touch on settlements and then give folks a chance to wrap up with any final questions. I did want to make a mention here that today at 3 o'clock, Luis Cantos of the settlements team is going to be leading a WEIM settlement user group meeting where we'll be taking participants into greater depth on the calculations of the settlements allocations. So we're going to give you a high-level introduction here on the concepts of what is changing, and there are a couple of examples to, have you start thinking about things in your mind, but I'm not going to dive really deep into those examples because they're going to be further deconstructed in that WEIM settlements group later. But if you were not aware of that, we've put a note in there from Heidi on how you can get in touch with us to get the details for that call. So we're going to talk about the settlements charge code updates. Because we are shifting to a nodal pricing model, it means that the way we calculate or calculate those cost allocations needs to change. So for every WEIM entity that passed either the flex ramp up or down, settlements will derive the total quantity of each category. There's going to be those reports that we've looked at in CMRI, OASIS, and BAYOP that will have that data you can use to validate those settlement statements that you'll get through MRIS. The overall process isn't changing, but the charge code calculations that feed into those results will have some modifications. Essentially, the charge codes are being updated to include an attribute for flexible ramping product passing group. This attribute allows us to change the way we account for whether or not a BAA will be included in the passing group to have their participating resources be considered for FRP during those market runs. And it affects how the costs get allocated out. So we have charge codes that are going to be impacted from a movement and an uncertainty perspective. And we'll break those down here. And I'm not going to read off the individual charge codes, but you can see some fall into the movement category, some fall into uncertainty. And then the way those get settled, under FRP movement, there is the flex ramp up marginal price and the flex ramp down marginal price, and those are going to be used to distinguish the up and down awards. And the passing group is going to be incorporated into movement, preparing for the allocation piece of it, using a specific flag for the flex ramp test. When we talk about uncertainty for flex ramp up or down, those uncertainty awards are going to be settled at the resource specific flex ramp up marginal price or flex ramp down marginal price. Some of these acronyms are pretty intense. And then the uncertainty awards settlement is a deviation settlement from the 15-minute market award at a resource-specific price. The prices no longer carry a specific Q constraint ID, so the formulas are going to be updated to reflect that change. And now instead it'll be introduced using that flex ramp test results flag. So that's just another item to point out for you there. With regard to allocation, so there's going to be a new allocation methodology, pass versus fail for the flex ramp sufficiency test. If the BAA passes, then the allocation of movement award costs will be across all WEIM entities that belong to the passing group. And if they fail, then the movement award will be isolated to the metered demand in that one respective BAA. So if you're in a passing group, it gets allocated out. If you're in a failing group, you're in your own BAA and you have those movement awards isolated. And then allocations for uncertainty will be done both at a daily and a monthly value. Daily allocation for up or down, it stays a two-tier cost allocation by resource category methodology based on whether you're in the passing or the failing group, and monthly as well. And then there are a couple of examples. Like I said, these are the examples that Luis is going to go through at 3 o'clock. I want to make sure we give you enough time to get to that 3 o'clock meeting. So I'm going to just kind of mention these at a high level, and these are the settlements examples that'll be gone into at length. But essentially, there's going to be different settlement allocations. For example, there's BAAs that will be passing both the flex ramp and down tests. And so in that case, movement and allocation is settled in one way. There will be situations where the BAA may fail both of those tests, flex ramp up and down. And so then their settlement is going to be allocated out a different way, individually to their own BAA meter demand. You might pass one flex ramp up, for example, and fail the flex ramp down. In that case, those will be treated differently. Or you could fail the flex ramp up and pass the flex ramp down. So there's 4 different ways that each one of these could be settled depending on whether you're passing all, failing all, passing one or the other, or failing one or the other. And like I said, those, I don't want to steal the thunder of the 3 o'clock meeting, so we'll keep it at a high level with regard to the examples, but those are things that you can be thinking about and kind of gathering your questions for the 3 o'clock meeting. But with that, we've come to at least the end of these slides. And so we've got a little bit of time here if you want to ask any follow-up questions. And we'll let, I'll be quiet so we can see if there's questions.
Rada, we do have some questions. There is one from Grayson, and actually, it's a question and a comment. He said, thank you for clarifying the earlier one. That is, thank you for clarifying earlier that one difference between reg up and flex up is that you have to opt into bidding into the reg up while you're automatically bid into flex up. And then he goes on to say, this distinction makes it sound like reg up is not co-optimized with energy, while flex up is co-optimized with energy, but that's not consistent with the fact that energy and AS are typically co-optimized. Can you help clear up my confusion? Rada, would you like one of our SMEs to cover this?
If we have someone that has an answer to that, I'll take their answer, or I can do my best to answer it as well. But if somebody has an answer for that, I'll take it.
I've forwarded it to our SMEs to review. We can come back on that, or we can provide a response to that after. Just giving it a few minutes for our SMEs to see if they'll be able to respond.
All right, yeah, let's hold on to that for just a moment in case somebody else can come up with a better answer than what I could probably try to construct off the top of my head here.
No problem.
While we're waiting for that, are there any other questions, any verbal questions that we wanted to go over?
I don't see any hands raised also. And again, if you have any questions you'd like to verbalize, please feel free to use the virtual hand raise and ask your question. Otherwise, feel free to add them to the chat.
It looks like maybe John has a question.
I was just sort of curious, does this then take away the locking of ETSRs if there is a failure in the whatever 15-minute interval in flex ramp and it switches over to this financial way of handling it going forward?
That's a good question. Do we still have Michael on? I'm looking real fast. Or did he drop off?
Michael, it looks like Michael may have stepped away. Michael may have stepped away, so we can take that one back and provide an answer at a later time, unless we have another SME that might be able to chime in. I'm checking on that right now. We may have to take that that question back and provide that response after this training, if that's okay.
Did you have my question, or do you need me to put it in the chat?
If you can put it in the chat, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, I'll do that right now. Thanks.
Appreciate that.
Back to the comment about whether regulation ethics co-optimized with energy, it is. All ancillary services and FlexUp are co-optimized with energy.
All right, thanks, Jenny.
Okay. Outside of that, Radha, I don't believe we have any further questions in the chat. And again, raise your hands if you have any additional questions you'd like to vocalize. Otherwise, we don't see any further questions. Back to you, Radha.
All right, so yeah, I think we still have that question pending about how this affects locking of ETSRs that John has just posted in the chat, and we'll get back to the group on that. But at this time, we're going to go ahead and conclude the session. So if you have any questions on anything presented here today, feel free to send an email to customerreadiness@kaisa.com and we can get those answered for you. I really thank you for your participation today. I have included in the slides that have been posted a couple links to other reference material. I will also make a little bit of adjustments to these slides and post them again. As I said, I added a slide since I posted them this morning. So that'll be up later today. But at this point, this concludes our webinar. I really appreciate your attention and participation. We hope that you found this useful and informative. Go ahead and you are free to disconnect, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.